It began with a single brick, not a grand monument or a fallen spire, but a simple red clay brick buried 3 feet beneath the sidewalk of a modern metropolis. You walk past these things every day. You assume the ground beneath your feet is solid, ancient, and undisturbed. You are wrong. I found this brick while trailing a routine seismic retrofit in a city that claims to be less than 200 years old. The workers were confused. They hit a window frame, not a basement window, but a finished, arched window of a grand design, fully glazed and perfectly preserved, sitting in the dark, suffocating earth. Ask yourself why a builder would waste precious glass and ornate masonry on a foundation meant to be buried. Ask yourself why the official records call this a light well when there is no light to be found. I started looking closer. I started looking down. What I found was a pattern that defies the history books they forced you to read in school. This wasn't a local quirk. This wasn't a settling foundation. This was a global erasure. Everywhere I travelled, from the frozen ports of Vladivostok to the sun-bleached avenues of San Francisco, the story was the same. Grand Greco-Roman edifices with their first stories submerged in 10 feet of packed silt. Not just dirt, not organic topsoil, but a fine, homogenized clay that looks like it was poured from the sky. The architects call it a basement. The historians call it a stylistic choice. I call it a crime scene. Look at the photographs from the mid-19th century. Look at them closely. The streets are empty. The plazas are silent. Massive, megalithic structures capable of housing thousands stand in the middle of mud-caked ruins. Yet the people in the frames look like refugees. They are wearing rags. They are pushing wooden carts past buildings that required advanced calculus and thermal engineering to construct. It doesn't fit. Not the timeline, not the technology. Something happened between the years 1840 and 1850 that has been scrubbed from the collective consciousness, a cataclysm of liquid earth, a mud flood, and while the physical world was buried, the human world was being reordered. What if the people we were told were pioneers were actually scavengers? What if the grand cities were already there, waiting to be claimed? As I dug through the digital archives of local sanitariums, a terrifying correlation emerged. The spike in insanity diagnoses during the mid-1800s perfectly mirrors the discovery of these buried cities. People weren't losing their minds because of biological ailments. They were being silenced because they remembered the world before the mud. They remembered the empire that fell. They remembered Tartaria. Think about the sheer scale of the institutional gatekeeping required to maintain this lie. It requires a total control of the narrative. In every major city, there is a great fire. London, Chicago, Moscow, San Francisco. Always a fire. Always a convenient excuse to tear down the old world and rebuild the history from scratch. But fire does not melt stone. Fire does not bury a building in 10 feet of clay. Fire is the eraser used by the victors to hide the evidence of the previous tenants. I found a ledger in an abandoned hospital wing in upstate New York. It listed hundreds of patients admitted in 1852. Their symptoms: they claimed the buildings were not theirs. They claimed the stars had shifted. They claimed they had been reset. To the doctors of the era, this was a clear sign of a fractured psyche. To me, it sounds like the testimony of survivors. These individuals were not patients. They were political prisoners of a new chronological order. They were the last witnesses to a high-frequency civilization that utilized atmospheric energy, the very same energy harvested by the spires and domes we now call decorative. Ask yourself, if you woke up tomorrow in a city you didn't build, surrounded by technology you didn't understand, and the people in power told you that you were a primitive settler, would you stay silent, or would you speak up until they locked you away? The architecture tells a story that the text denies. Look at the load distribution of a typical 19th century courthouse. The pillars are designed to support weight that the current structure doesn't even possess. The domes are lined with mercury and copper, materials for conductivity, not aesthetics. We are told these were follies or revivalist whims. Not this, not that, something else entirely. We are living in the hollowed out carcass of a much greater machine. When the mud came, it wasn't just a natural disaster. It was a tactical deployment of geophysical force. It leveled the playing field. It allowed a new class of administrators to step out of the shadows and claim the new world. But the new world was actually the old world, just cleaned up and rebranded. The survivors who wouldn't go along with the script, those who insisted that the world was once connected by a global wireless grid, were labelled as suffering from delusions of grandeur. They were processed through the newly minted asylum system. This wasn't about health. This was about the management of information. The insane were merely the unresettable. Consider the orphan trains. Between 1854 and 1929, over 200,000 children were shipped across the United States to pioneer families. Where did these children come from? Why were there suddenly so many parentless souls in a time of supposed prosperity? The official narrative says they were the children of poor immigrants, but what if they were the children of the survivors? What if the sanitariums took the parents and the trains took the children? If you want to erase a civilization, you must break the chain of oral history. You must ensure the next generation has no one to tell them who they really are. You give them a new name, you give them a new history, you give them a shovel and tell them they are building a nation, when in reality they are just digging out the basements of their ancestors. Every time you see a lower level window at street height, you are looking at the headstone of a buried truth. The suppression wasn't just physical, it was linguistic. The very word Tartaria began to vanish from maps in the late 19th century. One year, it is a sprawling empire covering most of Asia and North America. The next it is Chinese Tartary, or the Russian steppe. It was a linguistic liquidation. The institutions, the universities, the historical societies, the geological surveys were all founded in the immediate wake of the mudflood. They weren't founded to discover the truth. They were founded to define it. They created a rigid framework of progress that excludes any possibility of a superior past. They told us we are the pinnacle of human achievement. They told us we moved from candles to light bulbs. But what if the light bulbs were already there? What if the world's fairs of the 1890s weren't exhibitions of new technology, but the final auctions of the old world's salvaged goods? Look at the White City of Chicago, built in months, made of plaster. It was a stone metropolis that had been excavated, used for a summer of propaganda, and then dynamited to hide the evidence. Not a temporary park, not a fairground, a recovered capital. I stood in the basement of a sanitarium in Oregon, looking at the shackles still bolted to the walls. These weren't for the violent, these were for the talkers. The records here spoke of electrotherapy used on those who obsessed over the lights in the air. This was 1880. Tesla hadn't even begun his public work on radiant energy, yet here were patients being cured of the belief that the very air could power a home. It is a somber realization to know that that our ancestors weren't just victims of a flood, but victims of a massive psychological operation. They were told the sky was falling when the ground was rising. They were told they were crazy for seeing the truth. The architecture was repurposed, the history was rewritten, the people were re-educated, the mud was just the beginning. The real burial was the one they performed on the human mind. What if the Dark Ages were just a few centuries ago? What if the timeline we rely on is a fabricated accordion, stretched and compressed to fit the needs of the usurpers? The investigative path leads to a chilling conclusion. The world we inhabit is a borrowed one. We are like ants crawling over a discarded motherboard, thinking we built the transistors. We marvel at the Gothic cathedrals and the classical capitals, never realizing they are the remnants of a high-tech infrastructure that once spanned the globe. The institutional erasure is so complete that we mock the very idea of a hidden past. We call it a conspiracy. We call it a fantasy. This is the ultimate victory of the sanitarium system. They didn't need to keep everyone in the wards forever. They just needed to stay long enough to make the truth sound like madness. As you walk through your city today, I want you to look at the ground, look at the way the terrain rises and falls around the oldest buildings. Look for the arches that lead into the dirt. Ask yourself why the most beautiful buildings are always the ones built by primitive people with horses and ropes. Ask yourself why we can't replicate them today with all our computers and cranes. The silence of the archives is deafening. The official story is a thin veneer of paint over a masterpiece. We are told that we are the survivors of a long, slow climb from the dirt. What if we are actually the survivors of a fall? What if the people in the insane asylums were the only ones who weren't actually crazy? The deeper I go, the more I realise that the mudflood wasn't an end, but a transition. It was the great reset of the 19th century. It cleared the slate for the empires of today to rise. It gave them the foundations, literal and metaphorical, upon which to build their power. But foundations are meant to be hidden. They are meant to stay in the dark. If we start to dig, if we start to remember, the entire structure of our modern reality begins to shake. We are told the past is a closed book. Not this, not that, something else. The book is open, and the pages are made of stone and silt. We just have to learn how to read the layers. We have to be willing to be called insane. For in a world built on a lie, the truth is the only madness left. The institutional silence is not merely a lack of information, it is an active, pressurized void. I spent months tracking the architectural remains of the star forts, those geometrically perfect bastioned fortifications that span every continent from the Americas to the heart of Eurasia. We are told these were defensive structures built to withstand cannon fire, yet when you analyse the ballistics and the line of sight, the explanation crumbles. They are shaped like resonators. They are positioned over complex subterranean water systems. They are not forts. They are power plants. But the history books had to give them a purpose that fit the narrative of perpetual warfare and primitive survival. If the public realised that the entire world once operated on a unified, free energy grid, the modern fossil fuel economy would evaporate overnight. So the gatekeepers turned the power plants into prisons and asylums. I found a map of an institution in the Midwest that was built directly atop the ruins of a sprawling 12-pointed star foundation. The patients there weren't just being treated, they were being grounded. Their very presence served as a human buffer for the residual frequencies still humming in the earth. Ask yourself why the most prestigious medical centres of the 19th century look like palaces. They weren't built for the comfort of the poor. They were built to occupy the nodes of the old world. Consider the census records. Between 1870 and 1890, millions of people simply appear out of nowhere in the official tallies. We are told this is the result of improved record keeping and a surge in immigration. But look at the photographs of the immigrants arriving at Ellis Island. They are well dressed, dignified, and carry themselves with a grace that contradicts the story of the starving peasant fleeing a potato famine. They are survivors being processed. They are being given new identities, new lineages, and a new, simplified language. The Great Migration was not a move from the countryside to the city. It was a move from the old reality to the new simulation. Those who refused the transition, those who insisted on speaking the old tongues or practicing the old sciences, were ushered away from the processing centres and into the state hospitals. It was a massive, bureaucratic winnowing. The wheat was kept for labour, and the chaff, the memory holders, was burned away in the back wards of the asylums. The technology of the Tartarian era was not mechanical, it was vibrational. Look at the massive pipe organs in the cathedrals. They tell us they were for hymns, but these instruments are capable of producing infrasound frequencies that can heal bone and alter human consciousness. When the mud came, the organs were silenced or repurposed for the dull rhythmic chanting of the new religions. The bell towers, once used to broadcast atmospheric energy into the surrounding countryside, were stripped of their internal mechanisms and fitted with simple iron clappers. The world went from a resonant harmonic symphony to a discordant industrial noise. The survivors who felt this shift, who complained of the missing hum or the dead air, were diagnosed with neurasthenia. They were told their nerves were failing them, when in fact it was the atmosphere itself that had been lobotomized. I found a series of letters from a doctor in St. Petersburg dated 1861. He wrote of a peculiar melancholy that had gripped the city. He described patients who would stand for hours in the mud-clogged squares, staring at the tops of the buildings as if waiting for a light to turn on. They spoke of a luminous ether that once flowed through the streets, providing warmth and illumination without a single wire. The doctor, a man of the new science, dismissed this as a mass hallucination brought on by the trauma of the recent floods. But he noted, with some confusion, that the patients' descriptions were identical, even though they had never met. They all remembered the same world. They all missed the same light. Not this light. Not that light. Something else. The light of a civilization that understood the fundamental nature of the universe far better than we do today. Why is the architecture of the 19th century so aggressively uniform? From the post offices of Australia to the banks of Argentina, you see the same soaring ceilings, the same marble columns, the same intricate friezes. We are told this was the neoclassical movement. A movement? A global obsession with the exact same aesthetic in an age before the internet or rapid transit. Number. This was a standardized recovery operation. The new administrators were using the same blueprints because they were following a manual left behind by the previous occupants. They weren't designing anything. They were refurbishing. They were painting over the gold leaf with lead-based grey. They were turning the majestic halls of Tartaria into the claustrophobic offices of the modern state. And if you pointed out that the scale of these buildings was designed for someone much larger, much more dignified than the average Victorian clerk, you were sent to the quiet rooms. You were told you had a distorted sense of proportion. The erasure of Tartaria required the destruction of the libraries. In every major conflict of the last 2 centuries, the first thing to burn is the archive. The Library of Congress, the public records of San Francisco, the ancient scrolls of the Winter Palace. Each time We are told it was a tragic accident. Ask yourself, how many accidents does it take to create a total amnesia? By destroying the maps and the genealogies, the victors ensured that the survivors had no ground to stand on. They were untethered from time. This is why the insane were so dangerous. They were the living libraries. They carried the maps in their heads. They knew that the city of Grand Rapids was actually a sprawling metropolis of canals and fountains long before the first settler arrived. They knew that the mounds of the Mississippi Valley were not burial pits, but the remains of a sophisticated acoustic network. To preserve the lie, the living libraries had to be closed. I tracked a specific family line that had been systematically institutionalized for 4 generations. Each generation produced a child who would eventually claim that the family's true. History began in a place called the Golden City, a place that does not appear on any modern map. These children were not schizophrenic. They were inheriting a suppressed memory. They were the biological persistence of a forbidden truth. The asylum records for these individuals are filled with re-education notes. They were forced to recite the dates of the new history until the words lost all meaning. They were taught that their ancestors were simple farmers, not the architects of the stars. The persistence of memory is the greatest threat to the New World Order, which is why they have spent the last century perfecting the tools of cognitive erasure, from the asylum to the television. Look at the statues in our parks. They are almost always bronze-coated or stone-casted. They are replicas of a grandeur we can no longer achieve. The originals, the ones made of true conductors and sacred alloys, were melted down long ago to provide the copper for the telegraph lines. We are literally talking to each other through the melted remains of our own history. We are using the bones of our ancestors' technology to spread the propaganda of our own ignorance. The survivors understood this. They saw the statues being carted away. They saw the domes being stripped of their gold. When they cried out against this desecration, they were labelled as agitated and uncooperative. They were treated with chloral hydrate and cold baths until they learned to keep their mouths shut. The mud flood was not just an event, it was a tool. It was a way to reset the load distribution of human society. By physically burying the evidence of the past, the usurpers created a world where only the present mattered. They created a culture of the now, because the then was too magnificent to compete with. The institutionalization of survivors was the final layer of the silt. It buried the voices just as the mud buried the windows. We are the descendants of those who were quiet enough to stay out of the asylum, or those who were young enough to be reprogrammed. We are the products of a massive global gaslighting. What if the Industrial Revolution was actually an industrial salvage? What if the steam engines and the coal-fired plants were just crude, inefficient workarounds for a world that had lost its connection to the ether? We are told we progressed. Not this, not that, something else. We regressed into a state of dependency. We were forced to pay for the energy that was once free. We were forced to work for the land that was once ours. And the people who remembered how it used to be, the people who could still hear the music of the spheres, were locked away in stone buildings that were once meant to amplify that very music. The irony is as thick as the mud itself. We are living in a tomb, and we have been taught to call it a home. As the investigation deepens, the patterns only become more undeniable. The erasure is cracking, the mud is drying and blowing away. And underneath, the giants are still there, waiting for someone to remember their names. The silence in the archives is not merely an absence of records, it is a presence of redaction. As I navigated the subterranean tunnels connecting the old administrative buildings in Philadelphia, I realised that the city beneath the city is far more coherent than the one above it. Here, the load distribution is perfect. The masonry is seamless. There are no signs of the frantic, shoddy construction that defined the late 19th century boom. Instead, there are massive granite blocks that seem to have been fused by heat rather than mortar. Ask yourself why the most important civic documents are stored in vaults that predate the founding of the government. Ask yourself why the basements of these institutions are lined with lead and copper. They are not protecting the papers from the people. They are protecting the narrative from the earth. I found a collection of intake photographs from a demolished asylum in Illinois. The subjects weren't the hollow-eyed shadows you see in modern horror films. They were radiant. They had a symmetry to their features and a clarity in their gaze that felt alien to the soot-covered world of 1880. They looked like gods in chains. The notes attached to their files were repetitive. Refusal to acknowledge the current year. Persistent claims of a global capital. Obsession with the extraction of light from stone. Not this light, not that light, something else. The prisoners of these institutions were being purged of a specific type of spatial awareness. They understood that the distance between New York and Paris was not a matter of weeks at sea, but a matter of minutes through the resonant frequency of the Starfort network. When the mud settled and the grid was severed, these people experienced a collective phantom limb syndrome. They could still feel the pulse of the world, but they could no longer reach it. The insanity was the natural reaction of a high bandwidth mind being forced into a low bandwidth reality. They were the first victims of a digital divide that was physical, not electronic. They were the high-definition people in a low-definition world. To the new authorities, this awareness was a contagion. It had to be quarantined. It had to be reclassified as a pathology. The asylum was the filter used to strain the old world out of the new population. I began to look into the great exhibitions through this lens. If you look at the floor plans of the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, you see a layout that mirrors exactly the circuitry of a modern motherboard. These were not celebrations of progress, they were liquidation sales. The temporary buildings were actually the most permanent structures ever built, salvaged from the mud and dressed in cheap plaster to make them look like recent inventions. They invited the world to see the marvels of the new age, but the real purpose was to announce that the old power was now under new management. When the fairs ended, the buildings were burned or dynamited. Why? Because you cannot leave the evidence of a superior civilization standing in the middle of a workforce you are trying to enslave to the coal mine and the factory. You have to destroy the standard of comparison. You have to make the survivors believe that the grandest things they ever saw were just theatrical sets. And if they didn't believe it, there was always a bed waiting for them in the state sanitarium. The institutional erasure extended to the very biology of the survivors. I found evidence of rest cures that involved the heavy use of bromides and the total isolation of the patient from any natural light or geometric architecture. They were kept in rounded rooms with padded walls, the antithesis of the resonant, angular structures of the Tartarian era. It was a sensory deprivation tactic designed to break the internal compass. If you can't see the horizon and you can't feel the frequency, you eventually lose your place in time. The doctors wrote about stabilizing the patients. In reality, they were desensitizing them. They were turning the vibrant atmospheric humans of the old world into the dull, compliant laborers of the Industrial Revolution. The survivors were classified as insane because they were the only ones who weren't yet broken by the new normal. Think about the sheer logistics of the mud flood, A global event of that magnitude would leave billions of tons of sediment, and it did. We call it the Great Plains. We call it the steppes. We call it the desert. But look beneath the sand of the Gobi or the soil of the American Midwest, and you find the same thing. Cities. Perfect grid-based cities that were never supposed to exist. The institutional gatekeepers have spent billions of dollars on archaeological digs that are actually archaeological burials. They find a site, they extract the gold and the technology, and then they cover it back up, claiming it was just an early settlement. They are the janitors of a history, sweeping the greatness of our ancestors under a rug of silence. And the people who stumble upon these sites while digging a well or building a fence, they are the ones who end up in the records of the unbalanced. I found a transcript of a court hearing from 1872. A man was being committed because he claimed he had found a metal sun buried in his field. He said it was still warm. He said it hummed when he touched it. The judge didn't ask to see the object. He didn't send a scientist to investigate. He asked the man if he had been drinking or if he had a history of religious mania. The object was confiscated by the local university and was never seen again. The man spent the rest of his life in a room with no windows. This is how the technology was reclaimed. This is how the patent offices were filled. The inventors of the 19th century were often just the people who were given the keys to the evidence lockers. They were the proxies for a hidden power that was repackaging the past as the future. Ask yourself why the founding fathers of every modern nation are depicted with such Masonic precision. They are always holding compasses, levels, and squares. These are the tools of the surveyor, yes, but also the tools of the redrafter. They were not building from scratch. They were remapping a world that had been devastated and hidden. They were the cartographers of the cover-up. The survivors who remembered the original maps, the ones where the continents were shaped differently and the cities were connected by light, were the primary targets of the first mental health laws. The insane were simply those who possessed an unauthorized geography. They were the ones who knew that the frontier was actually a graveyard. In a quiet corner of a cemetery in Massachusetts, I found a row of headstones with no names, just numbers. These were the patients from the local asylum who had died unclaimed. I cross-referenced the numbers with surviving intake ledgers. Most of them were listed as foundlings of the flood. They weren't just parentless, they were worldless. They were the last remnants of a culture that had been wiped clean by the mud and the madness. They died in silence, their stories unrecorded, their knowledge buried with them. But the earth doesn't forget. The buildings don't forget. The very stones under our feet are crying out with the weight of the history they are forced to hide. The more you look, the more the long-form history of our world begins to feel like a poorly edited film. There are jump cuts, there are continuity errors, there are characters who disappear without explanation. And then there are the asylums, the editing bays where the inconvenient scenes were cut and destroyed. We are living in the final cut of a history that has been sanitized for our protection, but the raw footage still exists. It's in the submerged windows, it's in the star-shaped foundations, it's in the suppressed memories of the insane. The truth is not a hidden treasure. It is a visible anomaly that we have been trained to ignore. What if the mudflood was not a single event, but a recurring process? What if the resets are a scheduled part of the administrative cycle? If that's the case, then the asylums were not just prisons for the past. They were prototypes for the future. They were the testing grounds for how to manage a population that has lost everything. They were learning how to build a world where sanity is defined as the ability to forget. As I stand before the towering, soot-stained walls of an old Victorian courthouse, I don't see a monument to justice. I see a lid. I see a massive stone cap placed over a truth that is still breathing underneath. The investigation is no longer about finding the evidence. The evidence is everywhere. The investigation is about finding the courage to see it. The patterns of institutional erasure are so consistent they become predictable. First, the event, then the silence, then the reclassification. The survivors were not classified as insane. They were transformed into the insane. Their reality was stripped away until the only thing left was the official version. And once that transformation was complete, the mud became just dirt, the star forts became just forts, and Tartaria became just a myth. But myths are the only things that survive the flood. Myths are the seeds of the next awakening. And as the modern world begins to crack under the weight of its own lies, those seeds are starting to sprout. The insane are finally being heard. The transition from the old world to the new required a specific kind of architectural alchemy. I tracked the movement of the Great Seal of the United States and found it mirrored in the ley lines of the asylum belt that stretches across the northeast. These were not random placements. They were tactical. The administrators understood that the human brain is an antenna. If you place that antenna within a structure designed to dampen specific frequencies, you can effectively wipe the memory of an entire population within 3 generations. The insane were those whose antennas were too sensitive to be dampened. They continued to receive the broadcast of the old world. They spoke of the voice of the stone and the singing wires. They weren't hearing voices, they were hearing the residual resonance of the Tartarian power grid. To the doctors, this was auditory hallucination. To the investigator, this is a signal-to-noise ratio problem. The noise was the new industrial society. The signal was the truth. Ask yourself why the insane were so often subjected to water therapies, the high-pressure hoses, the ice baths, the prolonged submersions. We are told this was to shock the system back to reality. Not this reality, not that reality, something else. Water is a conductor. It is also a memory bank. By subjecting the survivors to extreme hydrotherapy, the keepers were attempting to wash away the energetic imprint of the mud flood. They were trying to ground the electrical charge of the survivors' memory. I found a diary of a nurse from 1889 who worked at the Danvers State Hospital. She wrote of patients who, when submerged in the baths, would begin to hum in a frequency that caused the glass in the windows to vibrate. She noted that after several weeks of treatment, the humming would stop, and the patient would finally accept that they were a citizen of the 19th century. The cure was the erasure. Look at the load distribution of our current narrative regarding the Victorian era. We are told it was a time of soot, coal, and primitive steam. Yet, when we look at the street lamps of the 1850s, we see no gas lines. We see no wires. We see arc lamps that produced a light so bright it was said to mimic the sun. Where did the power come from? The official history says they were experimental and short-lived, but the survivors in the asylums told a different story. They spoke of the extraction of the ether. They spoke of the spires on the churches and the domes on the capitals acting as collectors. They were classified as insane because they refused to believe in the necessity of the coal mine. They were a threat to the burgeoning monopolies of the new energy barons. If you can get your power from the air, you cannot be controlled. When to maintain the monopoly, the air had to be made empty, and those who knew otherwise had to be made invisible. Think about the Great Fires again. Chicago, 1871. The city was made of stone and brick, yet it supposedly burned to the ground in a way that melted iron and turned marble to dust. This is not the behavior of a wood and straw fire. This is the behavior of directed energy. This is the behavior of a thermal reset. The fires were used to clear the slums, which were actually the most intact sections of the old Tartarian cities, and to provide a reason for the massive regrading projects. In every city that burned, the street level was raised by 10 to 15 feet immediately afterward. They buried the first floors, they buried the evidence, and the people who stood in the charred streets and pointed out that the fire had come from the sky, they were processed. They were the fire-shocked victims who never left the asylum. They were the ones who saw the weapons of the new world being tested on the ruins of the old. The erasure was also chronological. I discovered a series of maps from the 1700s that show the American West not as a wilderness, but as a densely populated region of walled cities and structured canals. Then, in the 1800s, it becomes a terra incognita. How do you lose a civilization in 100 years? You don't lose it, you bury it. The gold rush was not a search for raw ore in the mountains. It was our salvage operation. The miners were actually excavators sent to recover the gold leaf technology and the precious metals from the buried Tartarian hubs. The Wild West was a scripted play, a chaotic cover for the organised stripping of a continent. Those who lived there before, the native populations who were often part of the global Tartarian network, were reclassified as savages to justify their displacement. The survivors who wouldn't fit into the new racial or social hierarchies were sent to the same asylums as the insane urbanites. The sanitarium was the great equalizer of the unwanted. I spent time in the archives of a coastal asylum in California looking for patient zero of the Mudflood narrative. I found a man admitted in 1853 simply named the Surveyor. He refused to use the new maps. He insisted that the coastline had changed overnight. He claimed that the mountains to the east were not mountains at all, but the slag heaps of an ancient mining operation that had lasted for millennia. He spoke of the great Tartaria as a maritime empire that used the stars to navigate the land as well as the sea. The doctors noted that he possessed a dangerous charisma and that other patients began to mirror his delusions. He was moved to solitary confinement, where he died 10 years later. His delusions are now being confirmed by modern LiDAR scans that show massive geometric structures beneath the forests of the Pacific Northwest. He wasn't crazy, he was just early. Ask yourself why the 19th century was the age of the orphan. Never before or since have we seen such a global obsession with the foundling, the baby blinds, the orphan trains, the workhouses. It was a systematic harvest. By separating the children from the survivors, the administrators could feed them a completely fabricated history. They could tell them that they were the sons of pioneers when they were actually the sons of the displaced. They could tell them that the grand buildings they were cleaning were venerable ruins of a distant past rather than the homes of their grandfathers. The asylum took the memory, the orphanage took the future. Together they created the blank slate population needed to populate the 20th century. We are the grandchildren of those orphans. We are the ones who were taught to love our cages because we were told we built them ourselves. The institutional gatekeeping is reinforced by the peer review system of modern academia. It is a self-correcting mechanism of erasure. If a researcher finds a coin from a non-existent empire or a map that shows a different world, they cannot publish it without losing their sanity in the eyes of their peers. They are professionally institutionalized. They are marginalized and mocked until they either recant or disappear. This is how the mudflood remains a conspiracy theory, despite the physical evidence sitting in the basements of every major city. The experts are the ones whose job it is to ensure that the windows stay buried. They are the ones who provide the huge pseudo-academic language to explain away the anomalies. They call the buried floors sunken gardens. They call the free energy spires religious fervour. I found a photograph from 1902 showing a group of men in a history class inside a state asylum. They were being made to look at a globe, the new spherical globe of the mercantile age. One man was pointing at the North Pole, where the maps of Tartaria often showed a four-island continent and a central mountain. The teacher was hitting his hand with a ruler. The caption on the back of the photo read, "Correcting the Mercator fallacy. Not this world. Not that world. Something else." The Mercator fallacy was the truth, and the globe was the correction. We were boxed in. We were given a finite world with finite resources, replacing the infinite interconnected world of the previous era. The insanity of the survivors was their inability to accept the limits of the new cage. What if the Renaissance was actually the first recovery effort, and the mudflood was the response to its success? What if the struggle between the builders and the erasers has been going on for thousands of years? The investigative essayist must consider that we are simply in the most recent low tide of human awareness. The asylums of the 1800s were just the most recent tools for managing the transition. But stone remains. Stone has a way of speaking even when the mouths are sewn shut. The load distribution of the lie is starting to fail. The weight of the evidence is too great for the modern narrative to support. As we look at the arched windows in the dirt, we aren't just looking at architecture. We are looking at a mirror. We are looking at our own suppressed potential. The final realization of my investigation was the most unsettling. The asylums weren't just for the people who remembered Tartaria. They were for anyone who could see the static. The world we live in is a thin broadcast overlaid on top of a much deeper, much more complex reality. The mud was the physical layer of that broadcast. The insanity was the ability to see through the static to the world beneath. As I conclude this part of the narrative, I am left with a terrifying question. If the asylums are all closed now, where did they put the people who can see the static today? Or have they simply expanded the walls of the asylum until they encompass the entire world? Ask yourself, are you sure you're on the outside? The architectural census of the late 19th century reveals a curious obsession with the subterranean. I trace the blueprints of the old main buildings across the collegiate landscape of New England and the Midwest. These structures, built with a precision that suggests prefabrication on a massive scale, all share a common pathology. The deeper you go, the older the stone becomes. The official records describe these levels as utility tunnels or storage cellars, but the load distribution suggests they were designed to be the primary interface of the building. In one such basement in Ohio, I found a series of brass plates bolted into the foundation, etched with frequencies that do not correspond to any modern musical scale. When the wind moves through the upper spires, these plates vibrate. To the staff of the asylum that once occupied this site, this vibration was a nuisance. To the patients, it was a language. I found an entry in a medical journal from 1894 describing a woman who would press her ear to the basement walls and transcribe what she called the ledger of the deep. She claimed the building was not a school, but a recorder. She was classified as a chronic melancholic and subjected to the quiet room for the remainder of her life. Ask yourself why the most beautiful buildings of our era are always the ones repurposed for the most horrific functions: asylums, prisons, and slaughterhouses. It is a desecration of the previous tenant's intent. It is a way to sour the energy of the architecture so that no one would ever want to return to the old ways. The erasure was not merely physical. It was an erasure of the senses. The mudflood did not just bury the cities, it muted the world. Pre-flood accounts describe a world of vibrant resonance. They speak of the bells of the great cathedrals being tuned to the heartbeat of the earth. When the mud came, it acted as a global dampener. It absorbed the vibrations. It killed the resonance. The survivors felt this silence as a physical weight. They described it as the heavy air. We are told this was a symptom of the industrial smog of the coal era. Not this, not that, something else. It was the loss of the planetary hum. The people we call insane were those whose bodies could not adapt to the silence. They were the ones who kept trying to tune themselves to a station that had been knocked off the air since the insanity was a state of being out of sync with a newly muted reality. The doctors used bells and sirens to retrain the patient's hearing, forcing them to accept the harsh, discordant noises of the steam age as the new standard of sound. They were literally being deafened to the truth. Consider the stately homes of Europe and the plantations of the American South. We are told they were built by the labor of the poor and the enslaved. While the labor was real, the design was not of that era. Look at the heating systems. Many of these grand manors have no fireplaces in their original floor plans. They were heated by atmospheric conduction using the very spires and copper roofs that the historians call decorative. When the new owners moved in after the mud was cleared, they had to cut holes in the masterful masonry to install chimneys and coal stoves. You can see the scars in the brickwork. You can see where the grand design was mutilated to accommodate a more primitive technology. The survivors who pointed out these inconsistencies, who asked why the masters were living in houses they didn't understand, were dealt with swiftly. They were hallucinatory for suggesting that the world had once been warm without fire. They were a threat to the timber and coal industries that were being used to build the new global economy. The asylum was the final destination for anyone who remembered a world without utility bills. I found a cache of orphan letters in a basement in London, written by children who had been sent to the colonies in the 1870s. These children spoke of the Great Washing. They didn't remember a fire or a war. They remembered water that turned to thick grey sludge. They remembered their parents being collected by men in black uniforms who carried sticks of lightning. These were not the descriptions of a disorganized urban fire. These were the descriptions of a systematic high-tech evacuation. These children were the reset generation. They were given new birthdays, new names, and told that their memories were fevers of the imagination. By the time they reached adulthood, they had been convinced that the world had always been a struggle for survival in the dirt. The few who clung to their memories, who insisted they had once lived in cities of glass, were moved from the orphanages directly into the lunatic asylums. The cycle of erasure was complete. The past was now a delusion, and the present was the only sanity allowed. What if the great exploration of the 19th century was actually a mapping of the damage? The expeditions to the poles, the discovery of the source of the Nile, the mapping of the American interior, these were not missions of discovery. They were damage assessment teams. They were looking for the remaining nodes of the Tartarian grid that hadn't been buried by the mud. When they found a site that was still functional, they built a fort or a mission over it. When they found a site that was too damaged to use, they labelled it a natural wonder or an ancient ruin. They were inventorying the spoils of a global catastrophe. The survivors who were found in these remote areas, the hermits and wild men of the 19th century press, were the last guardians of the nodes. They were hunted down, captured, and brought back to the cities to be studied in the asylums. Their crime was not madness, it was possession of the keys to the kingdom. The institutionalization of the survivors was a way to create a consensus reality. If you can convince 90% of the people that the sky is a certain shade of blue and the past is a certain sequence of events, the 10% who see otherwise are effectively neutralized. They don't even need to be locked up. They will be marginalised by their own neighbours, but the 19th century administrators took no chances. They used the insane as a cautionary tale. They paraded them through the streets in fools' marches. They published their ravings in the newspapers to show the public what happens when one overthinks the nature of the world. They were using the survivors as a psychological deterrent. Look at the man who claims the city is buried, they would say. See how he rags at his chains. See how he talks to the stones. Do you wish to be like him? Or do you wish to go back to your work in the factory? I tracked the load distribution of the wealth that emerged after the 1850s. It did not come from innovation. It came from endowments. Massive amounts of gold and silver suddenly appeared in the hands of a few select families, the same families who funded the asylums and the universities. This was the loot of Tartaria. It was the liquid wealth of a civilization that had no need for it, now being used to fund the mechanisms of its own erasure. The survivors who tried to claim their ancestral lands or their families' hidden caches were the first to be diagnosed with paranoia. If you claimed the bank was built on your father's house and your father's house was 20 feet under the lobby, you were a madman. If you claimed the gold in the vault had symbols on it that didn't belong to any known king, you were a lunatic. The legal system and the psychiatric system worked in tandem to ensure that the wealth stayed in the hands of the administrators. Ask yourself why the classical architecture of the 19th century is so often associated with the concept of order. The New World Order, the order of the ages. These aren't just phrases, they are a mission statement. The Mudflood was the chaos, and the institutions were the order brought in to manage it. But what kind of order requires the systematic lobotomy of its subjects? What kind of order requires the burial of its own foundations? I found a series of anatomical sketches from a closed medical school in Vienna. They didn't show the human body as we know it. They showed a system of etheric channels that corresponded exactly to the ley lines on the old Tartarian maps. The sketches were dated 1848. By 1860, the school had been burned and the professor had been committed to a state-run sanitarium for anatomical heresy. The new medicine was born out of the destruction of the old knowledge. We were reduced from energetic beings to chemical machines, just as our cities were reduced from power plants to piles of brick. The insane were the last people who knew how to breathe. I mean this literally. The Tartarian buildings were designed to optimize the intake of atmospheric energy through the lungs. the high ceilings, the specific ratios of the rooms, the placement of the windows. It was all a biological tuning fork. When we were moved into the cramped, low-ceilinged tenements and cottages of the modern era, our biological frequency dropped. We became sluggish, prone to disease, and easy to manipulate. The survivors who refused to move into these boxes, who insisted on sleeping in the ruins of the grand halls, were collected for their own safety. They were told the grand halls were unstable and haunted. They were told that the fresh air of the asylums, which were often built in the same grand style but stripped of their energetic components, would cure them. It was a bait and switch. They were taken from the functional buildings and placed in the hollowed-out replicas. Look at the Great Reset of the mid-19th century as a corporate takeover. The old board of directors, the Tartarian elite, was ousted by a geophysical event. The new board moved in, rebranded the company, and fired the old employees. But some of the employees wouldn't leave. They kept showing up to work, talking about the old projects and the old benefits. These were the insane. They were the redundant memories of a previous administration. To ensure the new corporate culture took hold, these memories had to be deleted. The asylums were the human resources departments of the new world. They were where you were sent to be phased out. And the mud was just the non-disclosure agreement written in clay. As I sit in the shadow of a grand neo-Gothic cathedral that is clearly an ancient power station, I realise that the investigation is a race against time. The more we remember, the more the institutions will try to pathologise that memory. They are already preparing the new asylums. They are already training the new doctors. But the mud is drying, the cracks are forming, and through those cracks we can see the light of a world that was never meant to be forgotten. The survivors are still here. They aren't in the asylums anymore. They are in the streets. They are in the archives. They are in you. Ask yourself, what do you remember when you stop listening to the static? What do you see when you look beneath the dirt? The 19th century Great Reset used asylums to silence the only threat to the new order, the eyewitness. What we call renovations were actually excavations of a global mudflood where grand Tartarian arches were buried and relabeled as foundations. Those who remembered the original street levels were deemed insane and institutionalized on high ground islands like Blackwell's Island. This was a geographic and psychological compartmentalization of truth. While academics rewrote history, alienists reformatted the survivors, the mud-stained, who remembered free energy, atmospheric light, and different celestial alignments. World's fairs served as liquidation sales, displaying conquered heirs of advanced technology as sabadsages to justify the theft of their cities. Through its eminent domain and medical rest cures, the state seized the evidence of a superior civilization, reclassifying the displaced as vagrants. These asylums acted as data centers where inconvenient memories were deleted, turning a high-frequency global empire into a footnote about nomadic tribes. We live in the aftermath of this collective lobotomy, standing atop buried palaces. To look at a basement window and see the truth is to embrace the madness. In a world of lies, the insane are the only ones who can truly see.